At the year-end barbecue, my wife confronted me in front of everyone and said, "I found someone truly successful." I replied, "Good for you." When her new boyfriend asked to meet the company's new CEO, they froze upon realizing it was me, and she immediately. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. But I'm going to tell you everything from the beginning because this story doesn't start that night. It starts 2 years earlier when Rebecca packed her bags, closed the door of our apartment, and told me I was never going to get anywhere. And for a long time, it seemed like she was right. I was 43 when she left. I had a small consulting firm that barely covered the expenses, a rented apartment in a quiet neighborhood of Buenos Aires, and an idea that no one took seriously yet, not my clients, not my acquaintances, not the woman with whom I'd shared almost 4 years of my life. Rebecca was the operations coordinator at Distribuidora Centenario, a medium-sized logistics company with a presence in 4 provinces. She earned well, had stability, and had been waiting for years for me to achieve something similar to what she considered real success, an important position, a high fixed salary, a title that sounded good in a dinner conversation. Why it didn't sound good in any conversation. The consulting firm was called MC Estrategia, and at that time it had 2 regular clients and some sporadic projects. I worked from home, invoiced just enough, and spent most of my time developing a logistics analysis model that I believed could transform the way medium-sized companies manage their distribution chain. Rebecca heard it so many times, she stopped listening. To her, it was the speech of a man who took refuge in imaginary projects to avoid facing that he simply didn't have what it took. One Tuesday in March, without a big fight, without exaggerated drama, she told me she was leaving, that she needed someone who was on the same level as her, that life couldn't keep waiting for me to take off, that she had tried, but that there was a limit to how long a person could bet on someone who didn't bet on themselves. She told me calmly. That was the hardest part. She didn't say it with anger. She didn't say it crying. She said it with the serenity of someone who had already made the decision a long time ago and was just executing the last step. She packed her things in 3 days. She left on a Friday afternoon, and I was left in that apartment with the silence, with the consulting firm, and with the idea that no one took seriously yet. The months passed. Caesar, my partner, and the only one who never stopped believing in what we were building, called me every week. Sometimes to talk about work, sometimes just to talk. He had been my partner since our university days. The kind of person who, when everyone says something won't work, looks at you and says, "Let's keep going." Without speeches, without empty promises, just consistency. And consistency, over time, begins to shape things. The logistics model I had been developing for years began to show concrete results. A medium-sized client implemented it and reduced their distribution costs by 32% in 6 months. Another client used it to reorganize their supplier network and increase their operating margin in a way that none of their directors had managed in 5 years of traditional management. The numbers spoke for themselves, and when the numbers speak for themselves, people start to listen. In 18 months, MC Estrategia went from being a small consulting firm to a technology company applied to logistics with 2 employees, 3 private investors, and active contracts with companies in Argentina, Chile, and Colombia. The initial valuation we had put on the project, when no one took us seriously, was $200,000. By the end of that year, we had closed an investment round of $1,400,000 and had advanced conversations with funds that wanted to get in on the next round. And then came the opportunity that changed everything. Distribuidora Centenario, the company where Rebecca worked, had been having serious internal management problems for 2 years. Losses in its logistics chain, high staff turnover, contracts that were falling through. The original owner, an older man who had founded the company 30 years ago, was looking for a way out. He wanted to sell, but he wanted to sell well, to someone who understood the business and could really transform it instead of dismantling it. Caesar sent me the prospectus on a Monday at 7 in the morning with a single message. "Read this." I read it, I analyzed it. I spent 3 weeks doing due diligence with our team, and at the end of those 3 weeks, we submitted an offer. The offer was accepted for $2,300,000. I became the new owner, and SEO of Distribuidora Scenario. The same company where Rebecca worked as an operations coordinator. The same company that had booked that haul in Palermo for the end-of-year barbecue. The same company where that December night she would look me in the eyes in front of everyone and tell me she had found someone with real success. I hadn't yet publicly announced the change in leadership. Only the management team knew. The formal communication was scheduled for the first week of January. Caesar and I had arrived that night precisely to make some informal contacts before the official announcement, to meet faces, to better understand the internal culture before formally introducing ourselves. No one in that hall, except the management team, knew who I was. Neither did Rebecca. When I entered the place and saw her on the other side of the hall, with her red dress and her glass of wine, and that laugh I knew by heart, I thought about staying away, about letting the night pass without any crossing, without a story, without either version of the past occupying the same space. But Rebecca saw me, and Rebecca decided to advance with her glass, with her smile, with Raphael by her side. And I waited for her, still with my glass in hand, knowing exactly what was coming. Raphael had the kind of presence he himself had built very carefully. It wasn't natural, it was architecture, the dark suit without a tie, the watch on his left wrist that caught the light every time he moved his arm, the way he occupied the space around him as if the space belonged to him by right. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with perfectly combed hair and a smile that always arrived half a second later than necessary, as if he first calculated the effect and then executed it. Rebecca looked at him with that specific mix of pride and relief that people have when they feel they've finally found what they were looking for. It wasn't just love, it was a demonstration, it was the satisfaction of being able to tell the world, and particularly certain people from the past, that she had made the right decision. I was that person from the past. Raphael has been with the company for 3 years, Rebecca said, with the tone of someone presenting a resume instead of a person. He's the regional executive with the best performance in the commercial area. Last year, he closed contracts worth over $800,000 in his zone. She said it looking directly at me, measuring my reaction with a precision that only someone who has been planning that moment for a long time has. Raphael smiled with calculated modesty. Rebecca exaggerates, he said, but he said it in that way people say exaggerate when they actually want you to repeat everything again in more detail. I'm not exaggerating, she insisted and looked at me again. I nodded slightly. Impressive, I said calmly, without irony, without the slightest trace of discomfort in my voice. That threw her off. She was expecting something else. She expected me to ask more, to be interested, to somehow show that the numbers affected me, that the comparison worked. But when someone responds with genuine calm and not with feigned calm, it's very difficult to know what to do next. Caesar, next to me, was still holding his drink, looking at the general atmosphere with a completely neutral expression. I knew him well enough to know that inside, he was enjoying every second of this. Raphael decided it was his turn. He leaned slightly towards me with that familiarity of men who confuse confidence with invasion of space, and said, "And what do you do, Miguel? Rebecca told me you have a consulting firm, right?" He said it well, with the exact tone of someone who knows the answer won't be impressive and is already preparing a condescending reaction. "Something in the logistics area," I replied with a single syllable, but that syllable contained a whole universe of elegant condescension. "Interesting. Do you work with large companies or more with SMEs?" "With those who need help," I said. He smiled. Rebecca smiled. One of the colleagues who was nearby and had started to listen without hiding it also smiled, although he wasn't entirely sure why. Of course, Raphael said. "The consulting market for SMEs is quite competitive, isn't it? A lot of people offering more or less the same thing. It must be difficult to differentiate." He said it with the tone of someone giving genuine advice, but the content was something else entirely. It was a reduction. It was taking what I did, wrapping it in something small, and handing it back with a smile. "Sometimes," I replied. Brief silence. Rebecca took advantage of it. "Miguel was always very consistent," she said, and she chose that word very carefully. Consistent, not brilliant, not ambitious, Not successful, consistent, like someone describing someone who shows up every day but never gets anywhere. That's valued, she added with a smile that was almost maternal, as if she were patting me on the head. I looked at her for a moment. Thanks, I said. Nothing more. She waited. He waited. The colleague next to us waited, and I simply didn't continue. I took a sip of my water, looked towards the grill where the waiters were arranging the trays of meat, and let the silence fill the space they wanted to fill with my discomfort. It was Caesar who smoothed the moment, not because he needed to, but because he found it fun to stretch the conversation a bit longer. How long have you been together? He asked, addressing Rebecca with a genuine and carefree smile. Almost a year, she replied, and there was a pride in her voice she didn't try to hide. That's great, Caesar said, and he said it so naturally that it was impossible to know if he was being sincere or not. That was also an art. Raphael took advantage of the opening to talk about himself, which was clearly what he liked to do most. He recounted that he had joined Distribuidora Centenario 4 years ago as a senior salesman, and that in less than 18 months he had climbed to the regional position, that his zone had grown by 40% under his management, that he had advanced conversations with the management to assume a national role starting the following year, that he had done a postgraduate degree in business administration at a prestigious private university, that he had contacts in the sector that opened doors for him that took others years to open. He told it all with that fluency of someone who has repeated it many times and knows exactly when to pause for greater impact. He was good at that. You had to give him that. I listened to him. I nodded at the right moments. I didn't ask anything that could be interpreted as genuine interest or as a provocation. I just listened, and that, paradoxically, made him talk more. Because people who need to prove who they are don't know what to do with someone who listens to them without reacting. So they up the ante, they add more data, more achievements, more figures. They try to find the point where the other person finally shows something, admiration or envy, whatever, just to confirm that the message got through. The message got through. It just didn't produce what he expected. At some point in the night, we separated. Raphael went to greet some colleagues from the commercial area. Rebecca stayed a moment longer with her almost empty glass, looking at me with an expression that wasn't exactly regret, but wasn't the complete satisfaction she had planned either. Are you okay? She asked me. And that question was another trap, because if I said yes with too much enthusiasm, it would seem defensive, and if I said yes coldly, it would seem hurt. Very well, I replied calmly, with the same calm as always. She nodded slowly. I'm glad, she said, and she went to where Raphael was. Caesar waited for her to get far enough away, and then turned to me with an expression that mixed amusement with something more serious. When does she find out? He asked in a low voice. When someone Googles him, I replied. He smiled. It's going to be a long night. We moved to another part of the hall. The grill was ready, and the waiters were starting to circulate with the trays. The atmosphere had relaxed. People had had enough wine for the conversations to be louder and less careful. I sat at one of the side tables with Caesar and with 2 managers from the operations area who already knew who I was and who had been tactful enough not to mention it at any point during the night. They were Andres, head of operations, and Hortensia, financial director. They both received me with the naturalness of someone who has already processed the change and is ready to work. Hortensia, in particular, had that calm energy of people who have seen many changes in a company and know how to distinguish which ones will improve things and which ones won't. The dinner went on. The noise in the hall grew louder. Conversations mixed. Toast began to sound from different tables. Someone had connected a speaker with more upbeat music, and some young employees had cleared a space to dance near the bar. I ate calmly. I talked with Andres about some operational aspects I wanted to review in January. I listened to Hortensia describe the most urgent financial bottlenecks. It was exactly the conversation I had come to have that night. Informal, without an official agenda, without PowerPoints, just real information told by people who knew the company from the inside. And then I heard Raphael's voice, not because he was close, but because Raphael had the kind of voice that rises when he wants to be heard, and at that moment he wanted to be heard. He was 2 tables away with a group of colleagues from the commercial area, and he had his phone in his hand. Hey, Did you see they already confirmed who the new SEO is? He said. I just saw it on LinkedIn. Look, the phone was passed from hand to hand. First, it was a colleague from the commercial area, one of those young men who nod before they finish reading because they want to seem like they process quickly. Then it was a woman with short hair who worked in administration and had been at the same table all night. Then it was another man I didn't recognize, and in each pair of hands that held that phone, there was a pause, a small pause of 2 or 3 seconds, which was exactly the time it took for each person to connect the photo on the screen with the face that was sitting 2 tables away. Raphael still hadn't made that connection. He was looking somewhere else when the phone came back to his hands. He was saying something about the goals for the next year, about his projection for the national role, about a meeting he had scheduled for the second week of January with the new management. He said it with that energy of someone who is at the peak of their moment and knows it. It was Rebecca who saw the screen first. She was sitting next to Raphael with her third glass of wine in her hand, and when the phone was left on the table between them, she looked at it by reflex. Just for a second, but that second was enough. I saw it from where I was. I saw the exact moment her brain processed the information. I saw how the expression on her face made that specific journey that goes from confusion to recognition, and from recognition to something that didn't have a name yet, but that was deep and silent like a crack slowly opening in the floor. She looked at me. I was eating calmly with my fork in my hand, listening to Andres talk about the reorganization of the central warehouse. I didn't do anything special when our gazes met. I didn't smile, I didn't nod, I didn't raise my glass. I just held her gaze for a moment, and then looked back at Andres as if nothing had happened, because for me, at that moment, nothing extraordinary was happening. Rebecca touched Raphael's arm. He interrupted what he was saying and looked at her. She pointed to the screen with a small, almost imperceptible gesture. Raphael looked down. The pause that followed was different from the others. It was longer. It was one of those pauses that have their own weight, that occupy the air in a different way. Then, Raphael looked up and looked for me among the tables. "We found me." He froze. I looked at him with the same calm with which I had looked at everything that night, without triumph, without visible satisfaction, without any of the expressions he probably expected to find. Just calm. The calm of someone who has known for months what others have just discovered in the last 30 seconds. Caesar, who had been following the scene with peripheral vision while talking with Hortensia, turned slightly towards me and in a very low voice said a single word, "Now." I nodded. What happened in the next few minutes was interesting to watch. Raphael didn't get up immediately. He didn't come straight to me with a question or an apology or any of the reactions one might expect. First, he processed. I saw it in his face, in the way he looked at the screen. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at Rebecca, then back at the screen. He was reorganizing the whole night in his head. He was replaying every comment, every condescending smile, every word chosen to diminish what I did, and he was seeing all of that with new information. He was an intelligent man. You had to give him that too. Rebecca, on the other hand, reacted differently. Rebecca didn't process inwardly. Rebecca stiffened. I saw it in the way she placed her glass on the table with too much care, in the way her shoulders rose slightly, in the way her jaw tensed. She wasn't reorganizing the night. She was trying to find a way out, a narrative, a way for what she had just discovered not to mean what it clearly meant. It was Raphael who stood up first. He walked towards our table with measured steps, with that composure of someone who knows they've made a mistake but isn't going to show it until they have more information. He stopped next to me, extended his hand, and said, "Miguel, sorry, I don't think I introduced myself properly before." I shook his hand. "No problem," I said. "I just saw on LinkedIn," he paused. "Are you the new SEO of Centenario?" "Yes," I replied, without drama, without a theatrical pause, just the direct confirmation of a fact. The silence that followed was one of those you feel in your chest. Andres and Hortensia, who had been following the conversation without intervening, were looking at their plates with a discretion that was almost perfect. Caesar was looking towards the grill with a completely neutral expression that I knew very well, and that meant he was using all his concentration not to smile. Raphael regained his composure fairly quickly. You have to give him that. Good to meet you formally then, he said. I'm really looking forward to talking about the plans for the commercial area. I think there's a huge potential that hasn't been fully exploited yet. Sure, I said. We'll organize the team meetings in January. Perfect, he nodded. He smiled. A different smile from all the ones at the beginning of the night. This one wasn't of superiority. This one was of recalibration. Well, see you then. He went back to his table. I turned to Caesar. He looked at me. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then Hortensia, without looking up from her plate, said in a very low voice, "That was well handled." Caesar finally smiled. Just a little, just enough. I went back to my dinner. What I was interested in observing now was Rebecca, because Raphael had processed the situation with the logic of an executive who understands that he's just been put in an uncomfortable position in front of his new indirect boss and needs to correct course. That was manageable. That was predictable. Raphael was going to be professional because it was in his best interest to do so. Rebecca was different. Rebecca didn't have that equanimity. Rebecca had built a whole narrative about who I was and who she was, about who had made the right decision and who had been left behind. That narrative wasn't just a story she told others. It was a story she told herself. And when a story you tell yourself breaks in public, the reaction isn't rational, it's visceral. I watched her from a distance for the next 20 minutes. I saw that she spoke little. I saw that she drank from her glass more frequently than usual. I saw that at one point Raphael said something to her in a low voice, and she responded with a sharp nod of the kind that doesn't admit continuation. I saw that a colleague approached her table and that Rebecca smiled, but that the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was the longest end of the night she had had in a long time. Around 11, when the event was starting to wind down and people were beginning to say their goodbyes, Rebecca got up alone and walked to the bar. She leaned on the counter with her glass and looked at nothing in particular with that expression of someone who needs 2 minutes without anyone talking to them. Caesar looked at me. I shook my head slightly. It wasn't the time to approach. There was nothing that needed to be said that night. Everything that needed to be said had already been said without words, with information and with silence, which are the two most forceful forms of communication that exist. I said goodbye to Andres and Hortensia. I shook hands, exchanged a few comments about the first week of January. I confirmed schedules. Everything calm, everything normal, everything with the cadence of people who have work to do and are focused on doing it well. As I passed near the bar on my way to the exit, Rebecca saw me. I didn't say anything, just nodded slightly, with the same calm with which I had handled the whole night. She held my gaze for a second, two, then looked down at her glass. I went out in the night air with Caesar by my side. Outside on the sidewalk, he lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. "How do you feel?" he asked. I thought about the answer for a moment. "Good," I said. "I feel good." And it was true. There was no loud satisfaction, no triumph that needed to be celebrated. It was something quieter than that. It was a specific feeling of having built something real for a long time, in silence, without anyone seeing it, and that suddenly that something spoke for itself without me having to say a single word. Caesar smoked in silence for a moment, then said, "January's going to be interesting." "Yes," I replied, "it is." We hailed a taxi. The Buenos Aires night was still lit up around us, with that soft end-of-year noise that cities have when they're about to close one cycle and open another. I looked out the window as the car moved and thought about everything that was coming, the team meetings, the operational reorganization, the new contracts, the second investment round that Caesar and I had almost closed. I thought about Rebecca leaning on that bar with her glass and her silence, and I didn't feel resentment. That's what always surprised me the most. I didn't feel resentment. I felt something more like the understanding that people make decisions with the information they have at the time, and that sometimes that information is incomplete. Rebecca had made her decisions with what she knew then. What she didn't know then was what was to come. Now she knew, and January hadn't even started yet. January 3rd arrived with the dry heat that Buenos Aires has in summer when there's no wind. I walked into the offices of Distribuidor Centenario at 8:30 in the morning with Caesar by my side and a clear agenda for the week. First formal day as SEO, no long speech, no presentation with fireworks, None of those opening ceremonies that, rather than conveying confidence, convey the need to be validated. Amelia, the director of human resources, received us at the entrance. She was a woman in her 50s, dark hair, with some gray she didn't try to hide, a direct gaze, and that specific tone of voice of people who have been handling complicated situations for years and no longer get flustered easily. She shook my hand firmly. "Welcome, Miguel. Everything is ready for the 9 o'clock meeting." "Thanks, Amelia," I said. "How's the team?" She paused briefly, expectant, she replied, and in that word, there was more information than it seemed. The general meeting was in the main room on the second floor. All the area heads, regional coordinators, and some team leaders were there, about 30 people in total. I introduced myself in 5 minutes, without a PowerPoint, without projected figures on a screen, without the kind of motivational speech that people listen to with an attentive face and forget before they reach the elevator. I said who I was. I said what we were going to do in the next 90 days. I said that decisions were going to be based on data and on real conversations with the people who knew the work from the inside. Nothing more. There were questions. I answered them with the information I had. And when I didn't have the information, I said I didn't have it yet. That generated more trust than any improvised answer could have. The meeting ended in 40 minutes. As people were leaving, I saw Raphael in the group. He was near the door with a notebook in his hand and a carefully neutral expression. He looked at me as he passed. I nodded. He nodded. That was all. Professional. Clean, with no visible trace of what had happened 5 days earlier in that hall in Palermo. What I didn't know was what was happening beneath that surface. Amelia told me that same afternoon when we sat down to review the state of the commercial team. She told me that on Monday morning, before I arrived, Raphael had requested an urgent meeting with her. That in that meeting he had tried to position himself as the natural candidate for the role of National Commercial Director, a position that didn't yet exist formally, but that he assumed would be created with the new management, that he had presented his numbers, his regional achievements, his contacts in the sector, that he had done everything right in terms of form, but that the timing and urgency gave him away. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "That all the roles in the new structure would be defined in the reorganization process, and that he would have the same opportunity as any other member of the team to show his work," Amelia replied. "Good," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "Do you know he's in a relationship with Rebecca Suarez, the operations coordinator for the central area?" "I know," I said. Amelia nodded slowly with the expression of someone who confirms that the person in front of them already has the necessary information and doesn't need more context. "I just wanted you to know," she said. "Thanks." That first week went by with the cadence of real work weeks, one-on-one meetings with each area head, review of the numbers from the last quarter, visit to the central warehouse in the southern zone, where Andre showed me in person the bottlenecks he had described at the end-of-year barbecue. The problem was exactly what I had diagnosed from the outside: poorly optimized distribution routes, outdated software, manual processes where technology needed to be introduced. It was, paradoxically, exactly the kind of problem MC Strategia had been solving for other companies for years. On the Thursday of that week, Rebecca sent me a message, not through any official company channel. She sent a direct message to my phone, to the number she had saved from when we were together, and that I had never asked her to delete because I never had a reason to. The message said, "Hi, Miguel. I know the situation is weird. I just wanted to tell you I'm glad things are going well for you. Seriously. And if you ever want to have a coffee and talk without pressure, I'm up for it. No drama." I read it twice. It was a well-written message. It had the exact tone it needed to have to not seem desperate or calculating. It was the kind of message an intelligent person writes when they want to open a door without it seeming like they're opening a door. What it said on the surface was one thing. What it said underneath was another. I didn't reply that day. I didn't reply the next day either. On the Monday of the following week, when I had been in the position for 10 days, Rebecca requested a formal meeting through Amelia. She requested an evaluation of her position within the new structure. It was a completely legitimate request, the kind of request any employee could make in a reorganization process. And Amelia conveyed it to me with the professional neutrality that characterized her. I told Amelia to coordinate the meeting for the following week and to handle it herself directly as part of the general team evaluation process. Amelia nodded. Do you want to be present? No, I said. It's your area. She understood perfectly. The meeting between Amelia and Rebecca lasted 40 minutes. Amelia gave me a summary that same afternoon. Rebecca had asked about promotion possibilities within the new structure. She had mentioned her years in the company, her knowledge of operational processes, her relationship with the field teams. All valid, all real. But at some point in the meeting, almost at the end, she had mentioned that she knew the SEO personally and that she believed that could be relevant in evaluating her profile. Amelia had replied that the evaluations of the new management were based exclusively on performance and on alignment with the objectives of the new strategic plan. Rebecca hadn't said anything else after that. When Amelia told me that detail, I registered it without making any comments. But I registered it because there's a huge difference between a person who seeks to grow within a company on their own merits and a person who starts to use someone else's name as a bargaining chip. This difference isn't always visible on a first try, but it always becomes visible over time. Caesar called me that night. I told him what had happened with Rebecca in general terms. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "How long do you give it before she escalates?" I thought for a moment. 2 weeks, I said. I say 1, he replied. Neither of us was betting with malice. It was simply the recognition of a pattern we had both seen before in different contexts. People who don't get what they want through direct channels don't usually stay quiet. They look for another angle. There's always another angle. What I didn't know yet was what Rebecca's angle was going to be. What I didn't know was that whatever it wasn't going to change anything that was already built, because what is built on real work and concrete decisions doesn't collapse with conversations, with messages, with meetings, or with any of the maneuvers people use when they feel the ground is slipping from under their feet. That night, I closed my computer late, around 11. The office was empty and silent. From the 4th floor window, you could see the lights of the avenue and the quiet movement of a summer Tuesday in Buenos Aires. I thought about all that was left to do, about the processes that needed to be redesigned, about the contracts that needed to be renegotiated, about the team that needed to be consolidated. It was a lot of work. It was exactly the kind of work I liked to do. I put on my jacket, turned off the light, and left. January was just beginning. Caesar was right. It was a week, not 2. On the Wednesday of the 2nd week of January, Amelia knocked on my office door at 10 in the morning with an expression I was already starting to recognize. It was the expression of someone who has information they didn't ask to have and now has to transmit it professionally without it seeming like they're enjoying it or that they're uncomfortable. It was an expression of very specific balance. She sat down in front of me and placed her phone on the desk with the screen facing up. It was a screenshot of a LinkedIn post. Rebecca had made it. The post was 2 days old and said more or less the following: that she was in a process of actively seeking new opportunities, that she had been in the logistics operations area for years, and that she had solid experience in team management and distribution processes. So far, so normal. Anyone can look for a job. That wasn't what Amelia had come to show me. What Amelia had come to show me was in the comments. In one of the comments, Rebecca had replied to someone who asked her why she was looking for a change if she had been in the same company for years. And she had written, in full, changes in management sometimes bring complicated personal situations. It's not always easy to work near someone with whom you have a history. I prefer to be professional and look for another environment. The comment had 47 likes. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time to make sure I was reading exactly what I thought I was reading. It was smart, you had to admit it. It didn't say anything explicit. It didn't mention names. It didn't make any direct accusations, but it insinuated just enough for anyone who read it to construct whatever narrative they wanted. Complicated personal situations, history, environment, all carefully vague, all carefully loaded. I looked up at Amelia. How many people from the company saw it? Those who have LinkedIn, she replied, which are quite a few. I nodded slowly. Do you want me to do something? She asked. I thought for a moment. No, I said, not for now. Amelia picked up her phone and stood up. Before leaving, she stopped at the door. Miguel, just so you know, the management team is completely aligned with the new management. Whatever may circulate on social media doesn't change that. I know, I said. Thanks, Amelia. When she left, I stayed for a moment looking at my desk. I called Caesar. I told him about the comment. He listened in silence, and when I finished, he paused for a long time before speaking. Do you want our lawyer to take a look at it? Not yet, I said. Let's let it develop. Are you sure? Yes. Caesar knew my way of handling things. He knew I didn't react in the heat of the moment. He knew I preferred to observe the complete pattern before acting, because acting on someone's first move is almost always a mistake. The first move is rarely the real move, it's the test. It's the person throwing a stone into the water to see how deep it is and how quickly the current reacts. I wasn't going to be the current that reacted. What happened in the following days was interesting. The LinkedIn comment circulated among some company employees, as was predictable. There were conversations in hallways, in internal WhatsApp groups, that invisible but constant circulation that rumors have in workplaces. Amelia kept me informed without exaggerating, with the surgical precision of someone who knows what information is relevant and what information is noise. What Amelia was telling me was this. Most of the people who had seen the comment didn't quite know what to do with it, because on one hand, there was Rebecca, who was someone known within the company, with years of experience and relationships built. But on the other hand, there was the new SEO, who in 2 weeks had shown himself to be direct, clear, data-driven, and with no visible agendas. And when a person generates trust with concrete facts, rumors bounce off differently. They don't penetrate in the same way. On the Thursday of that week, Raphael requested a meeting with me directly, not through Amelia. He sent me a formal email requesting space in my schedule to present a proposal for the expansion of the commercial area. It was a well-written email with a clear structure and solid preliminary arguments. I read it carefully. I confirmed the meeting for the following Monday. What interested me wasn't just the proposal. I was interested in seeing how Raphael handled himself in a formal professional context with me after everything that had happened. Because there are people who in situations like that become servile, flattering, who try to compensate for the discomfort of the past with an exaggerated deference that is more uncomfortable than the original discomfort. And there are people who simply work, who leave the personal context at the door and enter the meeting room with the work done. I prefer the second type. Always. On Monday, Raphael arrived on time. Suit, notebook, prepared presentation. He sat down in front of me with the composure of someone who had decided to handle the situation in only one way, and that way was absolute professionalism. He made no reference to the barbecue. He made no gesture that could be interpreted as an attempt at personal rapprochement. He opened his computer and began a present. The proposal was good. It had market analysis, realistic projections, clear identification of opportunities in 3 regions where the company had a weak presence. There was real work behind those slides. You had to admit that too. I asked him questions. He answered them solidly. Some answers were incomplete, and he acknowledged it without getting defensive. That was a plus. At the end of the meeting, I told him that the proposal would enter the evaluation process along with the other initiatives of the commercial area, and that he would have an answer in 2 weeks. He nodded, closed his notebook, and stood up. He extended his hand. I shook it. Before leaving, he stopped for a second. He didn't look at me directly when he spoke. He looked slightly to the side, like someone choosing their words carefully. Miguel, he said, the barbecue thing wasn't right on my part. I just wanted to say that. It wasn't an elaborate apology. It was a brief, direct line without drama. I looked at him for a moment. It's okay, I said. Let's work well. He nodded and left. Caesar called me that afternoon, and I told him. He listened and then said, and Rebecca? Rebecca is another story, I replied, because she was. Raphael had made a decision. He had evaluated the situation, he had processed a mistake, and he had chosen to move forward with real work. That was one thing. Rebecca, on the other hand, was still in another place. The LinkedIn comment hadn't been an impulse. It had been a small, subtle strategy, but a strategy nonetheless. And people who start with small strategies don't usually stop there when they feel they haven't worked. That night, while I was reviewing the distribution reports from the last quarter, a notification came to my phone. It was a connection request on LinkedIn from Rebecca. I looked at it for a moment, then turned off the screen and went back to the reports. There was work to be done, and the work didn't wait. I didn't accept the LinkedIn request. I didn't reject it either. I left it there pending like an unanswered question, because sometimes the absence of an answer communicates more than any possible answer, and because I had other things to focus on. The third week of January brought with it the first big meeting with the investors. Caesar and I had been preparing the presentation for days. It wasn't a routine meeting. It was the first formal contact between the new management of Distribuidora Centenario and the group of funds that were evaluating entering the second investment round of MC Estrategia, the company that now operated as the technological arm of the logistics reorganization I had begun to implement in Centenario. They were two worlds that were merging organically, and that merger had a value that the numbers were beginning to clearly reflect. The meeting was in the offices of one of the funds on a 17th floor with a view of the city. For people on their side, Caesar and I on ours. 3 hours of conversation. Numbers, projections, difficult questions answered honestly, including those that pointed out real risks that we ourselves had identified. When you name your own risks before the other person finds them, it completely changes the dynamic of trust. At the end of the 3 hours, the fund's senior partner leaned back slightly in his chair and said, "We're interested in continuing. We'll send you the formal proposal next week." Caesar and I went to the elevator without saying anything. When the doors closed, he exhaled slowly and said, "There it is." "There it is," I repeated. It was a round that could reach $1,800,000 if everything closed well. That would significantly change the scale of what we could do in the next 18 months. That night, when I got to the apartment, I had 3 unread messages. One was from Andres, with a summary of the central warehouse survey I had asked for. One was from Hortensia, with an update on the distribution contracts we were renegotiating with 2 key suppliers, and the third was from a number I hadn't saved, but that I recognized immediately. It was Rebecca's mother. The message said, "Miguel, it's Noemi. I know we haven't had much contact since you broke up, but Rebecca is going through a difficult time, and I'd like you to be able to talk to her. I know you were always a good person. Thanks." I read it twice. Noemi was a woman I had genuinely liked during the 4 years I was with Rebecca. She was direct, hardworking, with that practical sense of people who have solved their own problems without anyone's help and don't understand why others can't do the same. She had always treated me well. She had always been fair with me, even when things between Rebecca and I had gotten difficult. But that message wasn't just from Noemi. That message was from Noemi writing what Rebecca needed someone to write, but that she herself couldn't write without losing the position she had tried to maintain. She was an intermediary. Consciously or not, she was an intermediary. I didn't reply that night. The next day, at the office, Amelia knocked on my door again. This time her expression was different. It was more serious. She sat down and told me she had received a call from a competing logistics company, Transportes Milenio, which operated in some of the same regions as Centenario. The person who had called was from that company's human resources area and wanted to check work references for a candidate who had applied for a regional coordination position. The candidate was Rebecca. So far, so normal. A person looks for a job, gives references, the company calls to check. That happened all the time. What wasn't normal was what the person from Transportes Milenio had mentioned almost in passing at the end of the call. She had said that the candidate had indicated in her cover letter that she had a close relationship with the SEO of Distribuidora Centenario, and that this gave her a deep knowledge of the company's internal processes and strategy. Amelia told me this with her usual professional calm, but her eyes said something else. I processed the information in silence for a few seconds. "What did you reply?" I asked. "That I couldn't make comments about current employees beyond confirming entry and exit dates," Amelia said, "and that any strategic information of the company was confidential." "Perfect," I said. But what Rebecca had done was a problem on another level. It wasn't just looking for a job. It was using my name, my position, and my relationship with her as a professional credential in front of a competing company. It was presenting access to internal information as an asset that had legal implications that I couldn't ignore even if I wanted to. I called Caesar that afternoon and told him everything. When I finished, he didn't say anything for several seconds. Then he said, "Now we do need Miriam to look at it." Miriam was our lawyer. She had been working with us for years, since the days of MC Estrategia. She was precise, fast, and had that specific ability to explain complex legal situations in language that didn't require translation. I sent her a written summary that same night with all the facts in chronological order. The LinkedIn comment, Noemi's message, the call from Transportes Malineo, the mention of my name in the cover letter. Miriam replied early the next day. Her analysis was clear. The LinkedIn comment was ambiguous, but not actionable on its own. Noemi's message was legally irrelevant, but the explicit mention of my name and of a supposed relationship that gave her access to the company's strategic information in a cover letter to a competitor was a different matter. Depending on what exactly Rebecca had written in that letter, it could constitute anything from a serious offense to something with more serious legal consequences. Miriam recommended requesting a copy of that letter through the appropriate channels and evaluating the next steps with that information in hand. I asked Amelia to initiate that process formally. Meanwhile, the company continued to operate. Team meetings progressed. The first operational changes were beginning to show initial results. Andres had implemented a partial reorganization of the distribution routes in the southern zone, and delivery times had dropped by 12% in 10 days. Hortensia had renegotiated one of the supplier contracts with significantly better conditions for Centenario. The team was responding well to the new dynamic. There was something I had learned over the years, and that MC Estrategia had confirmed time and again. When people feel that leadership is clear and consistent, when they see that decisions are made with criteria and not with arbitrariness, they start to work differently, not because they're forced to, but because they want to. That was happening in Centenario. And in the midst of all that, in the midst of the real work and the concrete results and the conversations about the company's future, there was the parallel thread of Rebecca, silent but present like something you know is there even if you don't see it directly. On the Friday of that week, a message from her came to my phone. This time it wasn't the calm and calculated tone of the first message. This one was different. It said, "Miguel, I need to talk to you. Not about work, about us, about what happened. I think there are things that were never said and that deserve to be said. Please." I read it. I thought about everything that had happened in the last few weeks, about the LinkedIn comment, about the call to Transportes Malineo, about Noemi's message, about the cover letter with my name used as a credential. And then I thought about that empty apartment on a Tuesday in March 2 years ago, about the silence that remained when she closed the door, about the hours I spent after that, looking at a project that no one took seriously yet and deciding whether to keep going or not. I kept going, and now I was here. I put the phone in my pocket and went back to the reports I had on my desk. The work didn't wait, and neither did I. The following Monday came with a development I didn't expect. Amelia arrived at my office at 9 in the morning with an expression I already knew how to read. It wasn't the expression of operational problems that had a different, more concrete, more manageable weight. It was the expression of human problems, which are more diffuse and more difficult to solve because they don't have a technical solution. She sat down, placed her phone on the desk. This time it wasn't a LinkedIn screenshot. It was a screenshot from a WhatsApp group, a group called Excenario that brought together people who had worked at the company at different times and were still in touch. Amelia wasn't part of the group, but someone who had forwarded it to her that morning because they thought I needed to know. In that group, Rebecca had written a message the night before. I read it slowly. It said that the new management of the company was making decisions motivated by personal rather than professional issues, that employees with years of experience were being ignored or displaced for reasons that had nothing to do with their performance, that she herself was an example of this, that she knew the SEO before he took office, and that she could say with certainty that the decisions being made were not as objective as they were publicly presented. It didn't mention names explicitly, but the context was clear enough for anyone who read it. The message had replies. Some people in the group expressed generic solidarity. One person asked if she had thought about talking to a labor lawyer. Another said that this was very serious and that someone should do something. I read everything, I read every reply. Then I handed the phone back to Amelia. How many current company employees are in that group? I asked. About 12, she said, from different areas. I nodded slowly. Miriam needs to see this today. Amelia nodded and left. I called Caesar before 10. I sent him the screenshot by message and waited. 30 seconds later, the phone rang. This is no longer ambiguous, Caesar said without preamble. I didn't reply. Miriam has it. She'll have it in an hour. Good. He paused. How are you? It was a simple question, but Caesar asked it with the specific weight of someone who has known the other person for 20 years and knows that sometimes the simple question is the most important one. I'm fine, I said. And it was true. There was no anger, no anxiety. There was something more like the cold clarity of someone who sees a situation developing exactly as they anticipated and knows what they have to do. Miriam called that afternoon. She had reviewed everything, the LinkedIn comment, the cover letter to Transportes Milenio, the message in the WhatsApp group. Her analysis was direct. The set of actions constituted a pattern that could support a claim for reputational damage, depending on what exactly the cover letter said, which we were still waiting to obtain formally, potentially something more related to disclosure of confidential information. But Miriam also said something else. She said that before escalating to a formal legal action, it was advisable to send a legal notice to Rebecca notifying her of the actions and requesting the immediate cessation of any public or private statements that could affect the reputation of the company or its management. This served two purposes. It established a formal record that the situation had been notified and was often enough to stop the behavior without needing to go further. I told her to proceed with the legal notice. That night, while I was reviewing the numbers from the first monthly evaluation of the operational reorganization, Caesar sent me a message. It said, "You only saw LinkedIn." I went to the app. Rebecca had posted something new. This time, it wasn't a comment on someone else's post. It was her own long post that began by talking about the importance of healthy work environments and how personal relationships within organizations could become toxic when there were power imbalances. She talked about her own experience without naming names, but with enough detail for anyone who knew the situation to know exactly what and who she was talking about. The post had comments. Many were of generic support, the kind people leave when they read something that triggers an emotional response without having the full context. But there were some comments that came from people who did know the context, former Scenario employees, contact from the sector, and those comments started to ask more specific questions. What Rebecca was building, deliberately or impulsively, was a public narrative. And public narratives, once they start circulating, are hard to stop. What she didn't know, or what she had miscalculated, was that that narrative had a fundamental problem. It wasn't true. And narratives that aren't true have a specific fragility. They hold up as long as no one challenges them with concrete facts. But when the facts appear, they collapse with a speed proportional to the speed with which they were built. Miriam sent the legal notice the next day. What happened in the next 48 hours was something I hadn't fully anticipated, although in retrospect it made sense. Raphael called me, not on the company phone, on my personal one, which meant he had that number from before. He had probably asked Rebecca for it at some point. I answered. "Miguel," he said, his voice at a tension that hadn't been there in the meeting on the previous Monday. "I need to talk to you about Rebecca, about what's happening." "I'm listening," I said. There was a pause. Then he said, "I don't agree with what she's doing. I want you to know that. I talked to her and we got nowhere. But I have nothing to do with those posts or with what she told that competing company. Nothing." I listened without interrupting. "I understand," I said when he finished. "Does that affect my position in the company?" he asked directly, without beating around the bush. I respected that. "Your position in the company depends on your work," I replied. "What Rebecca does is Rebecca's responsibility." Brief silence. Then, "Thanks, Raphael," I added before he hung up. "The commercial proposal you presented last week. We're going to incorporate 2 of the 3 axes you proposed in the first quarter plan. Amelia will send you the details this week." Another pause, longer this time. "Good," he said. "Thanks." He hung up. Caesar, when I told him, said, "Interesting." "Yes," I replied. I think the relationship between them is more complicated than it seems. Does that surprise you? I thought for a moment. No, I said, it doesn't surprise me. Because there was something I had understood since the end-of-year barbecue, since the moment I saw Rebecca introduce Raphael with the tone of someone showing off a trophy. Relationships that are built on the need to prove something to someone from the past have an inherent fragility. They work as long as the demonstration works. But when the demonstration gets complicated, when the context changes and the narrative breaks, what's left underneath isn't always enough to support what was built on top. Raphael was seeing it, and he had made a decision. The legal notice reached Rebecca that same day. What happened next depended on her. The legal notice produced silence. Not immediately. The first few hours after Rebecca received it were of visible activity. Amelia informed me that Rebecca had asked to leave work early that day with a health excuse, that she had been at her desk during the morning with her phone in her hand more time than usual, that two colleagues close to her had had short, hushed conversations that had ended with serious expressions. The WhatsApp group of former employees also had movement. Someone who was following the thread let me know. Rebecca had written a brief message saying she needed to take some time and that she wouldn't continue talking about the topic through that medium. No further explanation, no dramatic tone like the previous messages. The LinkedIn post was still active, but stopped receiving new replies. The silence was a sign, not of resolution, but of recalibration. It was the silence of someone who has just understood that actions have concrete consequences and who is evaluating what their real options are. Miriam called me the next day to confirm that the letter had been delivered and formally received. She told me we had a 10-day period to see if there was any legal response from the other party or if the behavior simply ceased. She recommended not making any additional moves during that period unless something new appeared. I told her we would do so. The company, meanwhile, continued its course, and the course was good. At the end of the third week of January, the numbers from the partial reorganization we had implemented in the Southern Zone were starting to show results that exceeded the initial projections. Delivery times had dropped by 17%. The rate of returns due to logistical errors had fallen by almost half. Hortensia presented me with an analysis showing that if those results were sustained for 90 days and replicated in the other zones, the annual operational savings could exceed $600,000. Andres was enthusiastic. He was one of those men who have known for years exactly what's wrong with the processes they manage, and who just need someone to give them the tools and the space to correct it. When that happens, the energy they release is considerable. I saw it in the way he arrived early, in the way his reports were increasingly detailed and more proactive, in the way his team responded to his new pace. The investment fund sent the formal proposal that week. Caesar and I sat down with Miriam one afternoon to review the terms. The proposal was for $2,600,000 for a 23% stake in MC Estrategia with options for expansion in a subsequent round. It was a solid number, not the maximum we had projected in the optimistic scenario, but it was real. It was on the table and had conditions we could accept without compromising the operational control of what we had built. We spent 3 days negotiating some secondary terms. At the end of that week, we signed. Caesar opened a bottle of wine in the office that night when everyone else had gone home. Just the two of us with our glasses on the desk and the city lit up outside the window. It wasn't a loud celebration. It was more like the quiet moment of two people who have worked for a long time towards something, and when that something finally happens, they don't need fireworks to understand what it means. Do you remember when Rebecca said you were consistent? Caesar said after a while. I laughed. It was a genuine laugh, one of those that comes out on its own. I remember, I said. Turns out consistency is useful. Turns out it is. We toasted. We drank in silence for a moment. Then Caesar said, "What's going to happen with her?" I knew he meant Rebecca. I told him what Miriam had said, the 10-day period, the silence after the legal notice, the absence of a legal response from the other party. Until that moment, I told him the LinkedIn post was still active, but with no new activity. I told him that Raphael had been working normally all week, professional, focused, with no visible sign that what was happening in his personal life was affecting his performance. Caesar listened to everything. Then he said, "And how are you with all this?" Seriously. It was the second time he had asked me that question in a few weeks, and both times he asked it in the same way, with that specific tone that doesn't seek an automatic response, but a real one. I thought before answering. "I'm fine," I said. "Genuinely fine. There's no resentment. There's no satisfaction of the kind you feel when someone falls and you wanted them to fall. It's not that." I paused. "It's weirder than that. It's like seeing something you had very clear inside finally become visible on the outside, and that doesn't generate euphoria. It generates something quieter." Caesar looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "That's maturity," he said. "Or exhaustion," I replied. He laughed. "The two things aren't mutually exclusive." The 10-day period Miriam had set ended without a legal response from Rebecca. The LinkedIn post disappeared on the 8th day, without explanation, without an additional post, without anything. It simply ceased to be. The WhatsApp group of former employees had also completely calmed down. Amelia informed me that Rebecca had requested a meeting with Human Resources to explore the possibility of a voluntary resignation with an agreement. Amelia communicated this to me with her usual precision. "How do you want us to handle it?" "With the same terms as any other voluntary resignation within the reorganization process," I replied. "Nothing special in any sense." She nodded. "Understood." The agreement was closed that same week. Rebecca would be leaving Distribuidora Centenario at the end of February with a standard severance package and without any additional clauses of any kind. It was a clean exit for everyone. What happened next, I learned from third parties, as these things are usually learned. Raphael and Rebecca ended their relationship in mid-February. There was no public drama, or if there was, it didn't reach my ears directly. What did reach me was a comment from Andres made in passing in a conversation about something completely different, who mentioned that Raphael was walking alone in the parking lot in the mornings and that he seemed more focused than before. In that way, people are when they have simplified their lives and the freed up mental space becomes work energy. I didn't ask for more details. It wasn't my area. What was my area was what I was building. And what I was building was advancing with a solidity that filled me with something that wasn't exactly pride, but something more like the confirmation that the decisions I had made in the most difficult moments had been the right ones. One afternoon that week, while I was reviewing the new contracts with Hortensia, I received a message from Noemi. It was brief. It said, "Miguel, I just wanted to apologize for contacting you last month. It wasn't my place. I wish you the best, truly." I read it. I thought for a moment about Noemi, about that direct, hardworking woman I had genuinely liked and who had acted from a place of concern for her daughter, even if the method hadn't been right. I replied, "There's nothing to apologize for, Noemi. Take care." I put my phone away and went back to the contracts. Outside, the February afternoon was beginning to turn towards sunset with that specific light that Buenos Aires has when summer begins to tire and the air changes slightly, almost imperceptibly, announcing that something new is about to begin. February was almost over, and with February a chapter was closing. March arrived with a south wind, and the offices of Distribuidora Centenario smelled different. It's not a metaphor, it's literal. When a workplace truly changes, when the processes are in order and people start to move with a purpose they understand and share, there's something in the atmosphere that physically changes. The rhythm of conversations is different. The hallways have a different energy. The meetings end with decisions instead of ending with more questions. They're small things, but small things are what build or destroy any organization from the inside. The numbers for the first quarter arrived in mid-March. Hortensia presented them to me in a 2-hour meeting with Andres and Caesar. The results exceeded the projections we had presented to the investment fund in January. The reduction in operating costs in the southern zone had been successfully replicated in 2 more zones. The customer satisfaction index measured through on-time deliveries had risen by 19 percentage points compared to the same period of the previous year. And the new contracts that the commercial area had closed under the new structure represented a 28% increase in projected revenue for the second quarter. Raphael had led 3 of those closings. He had done it well, with real work, with focus, with that energy people have when they've decided that the only thing they control is their own performance, and they concentrate on that with all the attention they previously spent on other things. We hadn't had any personal conversation since that call in January. It wasn't necessary. The work spoke with enough clarity. Amelia also presented me with the results of the team reorganization process. Of the 32 positions that had been evaluated in the formal process, 29 had been confirmed with new role descriptions aligned with the strategic plan. 2 had been converted into different positions with the agreement of the people involved, and 1 had resulted in a voluntary resignation. That one was Rebecca. Her name appeared in the report as one more administrative detail with dates and terms of agreement. Nothing different from any other record of the process. And that was exactly right. It wasn't a personal story, it was a management data point. Life within an organization works better when things are called by what they are. Caesar reviewed the numbers that afternoon with a smile he didn't try to hide. $2.6 million in investment at the end of January, he said. 3 months later, the results already justified double that figure in valuation. There's still a long way to go, I said. Yes, he replied. But the course is clear. The course was clear. That's what mattered most, not the numbers of a quarter that could go up or down depending on dozens of variables that no one fully controls, but the direction, the certainty that what was being built had real foundations, solid processes, people who understood where they were going and why. That's not built in 3 months. That's built in years of silent work that no one sees until suddenly the results make it visible. One afternoon that week, Andres knocked on my office door with a coffee in his hand and a relaxed expression of someone who isn't coming to bring problems, but simply to chat. He sat down, crossed his legs, and said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead," I said. "The night of the end-of-year barbecue." He paused briefly. "I was at that table when the thing with Raphael and the phone happened. I saw everything, and what struck me the most wasn't his face when he recognized you. It was yours. You didn't change at all, not a single expression, as if you already knew exactly what was going to happen." I looked at him for a moment. "I knew that at some point it would happen," I said. "I didn't know exactly when." Andres nodded slowly. "And you didn't feel anything?" I thought about the answer carefully because he deserved it. "I felt something," I said, "but it wasn't what people would expect me to feel. It wasn't satisfaction of the kind that makes you want to rub something in someone's face. It was more like the confirmation that the work I had done in silence for a long time was real, that it hadn't been in vain. That generates something quieter than satisfaction. It generates a kind of peace." Andres looked at me with a thoughtful expression. Then he said, "That's what differentiates people who build from people who just want to win." I didn't reply, but I kept that phrase because that was exactly it. There are people who work to win, to prove, so that someone who once underestimated them will see them and understand they were wrong. That engine exists, and it works for a while, but it has a fundamental problem. It depends on the other person. It depends on the other person watching, on the other person reacting, on the other person feeling what you need them to feel for the victory to have meaning. I had stopped needing that a long time ago. At some point in those 2 years of silent work, between the reports and the meetings and the nights in front of the computer, something had happened. The engine had changed. I no longer worked to prove anything to anyone. I worked because what I was building was real and valuable, and because every day that I moved forward was a day that mattered on its own, regardless of who was watching. That's the difference between building and winning. Winning requires a loser. Building requires nothing more than work and time. At the end of March, the investment fund that had come in January requested a follow-up meeting to evaluate the possibility of advancing the second round. The results of the first quarter had generated internal conversations within the fund that had led them to reconsider the originally planned timeline. Caesar handled the first exploratory conversations with his usual precision and informed me that if everything continued as it was, we could be talking about a second round of between $3 and $4 million for the second half of the year. It was a number that 2 years ago would have seemed impossible. Now, it was simply the next step. One night that week, late, when the office was empty and the only sound was the computer fan and the soft noise of the city outside, I sat for a moment without doing anything, without reviewing reports, without answering messages, without preparing for the next day's meeting, just sitting, with my hands on the desk, looking at the space in front of me. I thought about that empty apartment on a Tuesday in March 2nd years ago, about the door that closed, about the silence that remained, about the decision to keep going that I made not with euphoria or anger, but with something more like the quiet determination of someone who understands that the only available path is forward. I thought about everything that had happened between that moment and this, and I thought about something I had learned with certainty during that time, that the people who abandon you in the process don't deserve a place in the result. Not as revenge, not as punishment, but simply because the result belongs to those who were in the process, to Caesar, who had been there every week without exception, to Andres and Hortensia, who had embraced the change with genuine professionalism, to the team that arrived early and stayed late and did the work without anyone needing to ask them twice. The result belonged to them. The rest was history, and history, once it's closed, ceases to have weight. I turned off the computer, put on my jacket, turned off the light, walked to the elevator through the empty hallway of the offices of Distribuidora Centenario. The company I had bought with real work and concrete decisions and years of consistency that no one had seen until it was impossible not to see it. Outside, Buenos Aires was breathing with that slow, continuous rhythm that big cities have when the night advances and the noise subsides, and only the essential sound of things that keep working, even though no one is watching them, remains. I walked a block without rushing. The phone didn't ring. There was nothing urgent. There was no crisis waiting for a response, just a night and the work well done and the next day ahead. Sometimes that's all it takes, and sometimes that's exactly enough.